Hello and welcome to Identerati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. And today we're going to talk about why the US needs a trust framework for privacy. Identerati co-host today is Ross Ford, a longtime enterprise and government identity architect. Welcome, Ross.
It's great to be here, Mike. Thanks.
And our guest is David Keltz, a mobile driver's license expert. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Mike. I tried to make my background as interesting as yours for today, and I'm not sure I succeeded, but got part of the way there.
So, David, I want to dive into MDLs. Before we talk about the trust part of this, which is really the meat of the conversation, I want to start with MDLs to level set. MDL is one of many decentralized identity technologies. In your opinion, what are the strengths and weaknesses of MDL itself?
So I think from a functional point of view, one of the key things is it carries the digital signature from a government entity. So that makes it essentially legally a one-for-one replacement with the physical cards that we carry today, right? And it allows some of these digital interactions. So in the current incarnations of this, you have in-person transactions that are started, and you have flexible ways that you can interact to share that data. And then in upcoming versions, hopefully during the course of this year, there'll also be, and I've even seen one instance of it, there'll be over the internet presentation. So that's some of the advantages of it. I think the flexibility in how you can interact with it, different ways that you can kick off transactions, different ways that you can transmit data, that is it. And the fact that the user has selective disclosure. So they have control over the identity attributes that they share, which is unlike those physical cards. With the physical cards, the back has everything except the photo in that, the front has all of the data on it. So when somebody photocopies that or you upload it, that's all of the data that is shared, as opposed to with an MDL, then you can often choose what's going to get shared with that. So I think those are the advantages. I know I didn't cover disadvantages at this point, but I think there's plenty that have been talked about in the wild, essentially, right? The standards being ISO standards that you pay for has been perhaps a little bit of a detriment to some. So anyway, I think that that's part of it. And then also there's no matter what you do, and this will lead to our further conversation, no matter what you do with any of these identity technologies, there's the possibility to add in essentially tracking, surveillance, right? Like, so anytime you bring these things digital, there's that ability to add it in. That's certainly not built in, and I'm not going to associate that with MDL, but that is part of what is available in any technology. If you look at OpenID on the internet, or if you look at any decentralized, if you look at any credentials or ledgers, who controls the ledger, there's always an architectural component where potentially somebody could implement tracking or surveillance. And that's obviously a big concern to everybody, as well the wallets themselves. So anyway, that from a negative point, you asked me for both the strengths and weaknesses. I'd say the weakness is what we're here to talk about today. How we can address.
That's a good place to start. And ISO, like any standard, defines the technical mechanisms to obtain trust in the data. And in this case, we're talking about obtain trust when for in-person transactions. How do we get data from a MDL? But it doesn't mean that people will actually trust it just because there's a technical means to do it. In order for us to get people to actually trust it, what do we have to do? How do we build that trust?
Well, I think there's quite a few areas where trust is built. So, and there's different viewpoints on how that trust is built. So if you look at from the issuer's point of view, they're going to apply their digital signature to this because they did proofing, they did the issuance, they try to take care of the accuracy of handing that to the user for the user to control. And then you look at the relying party view, I think that they want for them to trust the system and to use it, they want it to be always available, which is, maybe not related to the actual identity trust, but if the system's down, they're not going to trust it. They do want accuracy. They want it to identify that person specifically. They want to know that they're getting it from the right holder. They want to know that you can't spoof it or inject fakes into the system. Although I would argue that that might be a lesser consideration, because if you look at what we're doing today, there are absolutely fakes and spoofs in the system with physical cards, and there's a tolerance for that that's kind of built in. And I think as well, like if this, as we came out from COVID, there's a little bit of that, contactless ID with a little bit of health improvement that may still have some residual trust value for people there. So I'm talking about the verifier view here. From the consumer point of view, being able to use this everywhere is a part of them trusting it. And, that's sort of getting over the annoyance of it not being accepted somewhere. Does it actually make their life better? Does it give them more control? And control, I would equate here with privacy. If they understand how the system operates, it's transparent, and they have control over the data, then they will, that will gain some trust as well. The health aspects here, and can it in fact streamline some of the things they do today, especially when you look at some of the things like photocopying my ID and uploading that photocopy somewhere on the web, and then everybody immediately thinks, where's this data? I have no control over this once I upload it, right? So that control is an interesting part of the trust mechanisms.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head. There's a cultural aspect to trust, right? Is that for the consumer to use this, they're going to have to feel that this is a normal part of what they do these days, right? They'll talk to their friends, and friends will say, "Hey, when I went here and I didn't pull out my mobile driver, my driver's license, I used my mobile driver's license." That kind of engenders trust. And you've been working in some states. So in states where they have already implemented mobile driver's license, are you seeing that kind of cultural dynamic occurring?
Where there's trust or resistance to trust. I mean, both do happen and are happening in places where this is rolled out. I think we probably have not yet seen sufficient enough uptake from relying parties to accept mobile identities, not yet, in order to know, whether or not there's kind of all trust in the system. But people's initial responses are really like, my data's already everywhere. What do I need this thing for? It's going to be easier to create fakes on a computer. I mean, there's the initial like pre-education response to it. So that you have to sort of set people with the concept of, hey, this is kind of like when you get a digitally signed PDF and you can't really change it, except for the fact that you get to select the section of this PDF that you share, and they can still go and, the relying party, the verifier, can still go and check the authenticity of that data. So.
And you wrote a great biometric update article, which summarizes, I guess, your testimony from Congress in July of 2021. And that is actually referenced on the wiki page for this episode. And in that article, you say that the win-win privacy design is to give control to the holder or the end user. But I'm wondering, who are the parties in that win-win? So the holders, who's the other party who's winning there? And what about, isn't this a three-party system of holder, issuer, verifier? Is somebody not winning? Shouldn't it be a win-win-win?
Well, I mean, what I'm referring to in the win-win is the privacy by design principle. So I think let's do not zero. It's not a zero-sum game. Let's have the security and have the privacy. Let's have the ease of use and have the privacy protections. And those are difficult things to build out in systems, but I think we can get there. And so as this evolved, all the participants need to be able to look at this and feel like they've gained from it. I think one of the examples here, and maybe this is taking a step too far, but from a relying party point of view, right now their viewpoint might be, the more data I get, the more data I can hold, the better off I am, because I can go monetize that data. And what's not part of that equation is that when the breach happens, and I just used the term, I used when the breach happens, that has a cost. And those costs, I mean, I've gotten breach notifications all the time where like minimum you can get $50, right? Or if you go and you had to pay to do identity, someone stole your identity data, you paid and you went through hardship for that, you could make claims for more. So the amount of that is pretty high when there's a breach. So now let's take this all and say, what's the win-win situation here? The win-win situation here is consumers having the control over what they share, verifiers being able to ask for merely what they need, and then potentially not even sharing that if there's a consent receipt that's available to them, right? That shows that the transaction happened. That may be sufficient. So like not sharing the data, actually not saving the data, actually can be a win. So I think those are the sort of win-win. It's just an example of sort of the win-win that I'm talking about, is how you can make this better for people and improve the entire situation and improve things for individual participants.
Yeah, I can see that. I've been a little uncomfortable with the number of times I've been asked recently to provide my driver's license, right? Because the service I'm interacting with, which I want to continue to do so, is under some pressure to verify that I am who I say I am, right? And while I encourage that, I'm disappointed that I have to provide them my, yet another copy of my driver's license, such that they can maybe lose it right into the wild again, Yeah.
And that's could be a pretty expensive, to have a problem on the other side of that upload could be a pretty expensive problem. And really all they wanted to do most of the time is figure out whether you're a real human being, like whether you're a live human. And so, yeah, the operation is much too expensive to the consumer. The operation is much too expensive to the relying party.
Yeah.
And David, as you pointed out previously, to provide that driver's license, possibly I took a picture with my phone, uploaded it to my Google Documents, and now it's sitting up there.
Oh, yeah.
So the whole process end to end, we're lucky if they just have the photocopy of my driver's license, but maybe actually there's a footprint of that from before.
Right. Yes. And I think that's what people are doing right now, is they're kind of storing them in their camera rolls, right? Because next week I'm going to get asked again. So
Exactly right.
It's not a good spiral for us to be on.
Yeah, I went through recently and just got rid of all the stuff I had in there in camera. They're like, oh, I really don't want that in my camera roll, right?
So think about like reducing this footprint. Like if you were actually issued a digital document and you could reduce all the residue that happens out of this on both sides, then, and merely authenticate yourself anonymously, perhaps to a service that says you're a real person who has been proofed. Because most of the time that is what they want out of these, then I think that's certainly the win on the consumer side.
So swinging this back to the title of the session, which is that the U.S. needs a trust framework for online privacy. We've talked a little bit about MDLs. We've talked a little bit about the privacy implications of that. And it seems like what you're advocating for is that we need some type of trust framework in order to get this win-win scenario to happen, maybe a public-private partnership to build this trust framework. What is a trust framework in the first place, and what does the public part of that trust framework look like that you're imagining?
Yeah, so I actually haven't said anything about how I think it should be produced. because I think regionally it's reasonable for all these different regions of the world that are currently working on this to continue to do so in the way that fits. But yes, I do think a public-private partnership would be smart in the United States because, I think that hits the best pathway. But in terms of what it is, so you want to have the rules of the road for participants in this ecosystem that's going to protect everybody, and you really have to be the protection that gets applied really has to be applied mostly to the consumer who has the least leverage in the participating in this ecosystem. So you want to have technical rules of the road that are going to tell you what are the proofing levels that you need to get into? What is, like, how are you assuring that attributes are accurate? How's the authentication going to happen? Standards for credential protection. So a lot of this is happening in lots of different independent efforts right now, which is great. You have, for instance, DHS, TSA working on rulemaking, right? Like that's going to address some of the component pieces of this. This is great because it's going to establish some of those technical rules. Who do those rules apply to? You don't necessarily want to have businesses like saying, well, that doesn't apply to us because it was federal government, right? And so bingo. So everyone needs to buy in together on these rules of the road. Then you have the business model for these. I think in the US it'd be very unlikely that we would dictate a business model, nor should we. But it does have to be a self-sustaining capability essentially to the trust framework and to these identity interactions. So that is part of it. You have to have the legal side of this. So, and really when you get down to it, I think this is why, from my point of view, this legal side of it is specifically why we need a trust framework in the United States, is because when all these participants are assumed to be operating to the rules of the road, right, that were established and the protections that were established. And there are chances that there's going to be a leak, or there's going to be something that doesn't happen according to those rules. How does the consumer then, who participated in a transaction that went wrong, what's their redress? How do they seek remedy for the fact that they were wronged? And that's why that to me is why the framework needs it would give somewhere like consumer protection is often it's the FTC that's going to take that on. Is the FTC equipped well enough to handle what's going to happen in digital space? And they're getting better equipped as I read more. I see that, right? But that trust framework and the rules established there would essentially gives the framework to then go back and fix some of the problems that might happen. And maybe I should say this in a more summary way too. Making sure privacy works is the responsibility of all of the ecosystem participants. Because it doesn't matter how good your architecture is. You can have smart contracts and DAOs and these things that like create legal relationships between people or create legal relationships in a machine way. In the end, something might happen that's going to have that go wrong, and that's going to impact somebody's privacy. And that's where you need to fall back to a trust framework. And I think it's been sad. I guess I'll try to couch my words. I mean, it's been sad to me that in the U.S. we haven't, on a governmental level, started to try to make this happen. We've done it in the past with Identity Ecosystem Steering Group and NSTIC strategies and so on that were kickstarts for this, and that we haven't gone back to it is disappointing. And I don't want us to find out because somebody got really harmed.
Are you talking about the scope just within mobile driver's license, or is there a bigger scope
No,
of?
there's a bigger scope because all right. So then let's define mobile driver's license as well. It has become defined as an implementation of the particular ISO standard. I wouldn't expect that that's going to be used everywhere. There are other technology standards that apply in different situations better. My birth certificate should probably be handed to me as a verifiable credential with, a distributed ledger for someone to check the information, right? If they're authorized to. That's how it should be. And all of these things apply. So if MDL is a mobile driver's license, there are lots of other identity documents that I have. There are lots of other things I'm going to put in my wallet, and it needs to apply to those all.
And David, I think that's been one of the challenges, right? Is it that people have easily conflated the various types of digital credentialing that we want to do, kind of as one as the other. I think Kalia, your guest last week, Mike, did a really great job a few months ago about talking about the kind of the different perspectives that people have on mobile driver's licenses and other forms of verifiable credentials. And I think this is part of the conversation, right? About how do we do what we need to do with mobile driver's licenses as they're envisioned under ISO standards right now, and then what are the other things that we need to do? And I agree with David is that trust frameworks they're essential for all of these, right? And what's important is that the trust framework's explicit about the things that you can offer through that trust framework. And it may not be everything that people want to do. It may not be always privacy enhancing, right? That's going to be one of the challenges is that there are people that are trying to build frameworks of interaction right now that they don't really have an interest in the privacy enhancing part of that, right? There's monetization for them. And I want them to explicitly talk about what levels of guarantees they can or aren't going to provide in that, right? I think we just generally need to do better about explaining here's the system of interaction that I'm building. These are the things you can expect from it. And this is back to the technical controls of ISO, right? It specifies some technical controls, right? And so you can rely on those technical controls. It is not the only area, Mike. We talked earlier about SBOMs, and the government is trying to help people to define what your software bill of materials are, right? And it is in my mind, to get to there, you got to have a cryptographic chain of control from the time somebody creates an artifact to the time they can attest it, as a bunch of things that are aggregated together. I think much of this is going to be the same in terms of the credential that we provide digitally to use in a context like mobile driver's licenses. What do you think about that, Dave?
I'm going to turn. I was looking at you, Mike, as
I'll jump in there and
was.
say a few words. As a software vendor, it's really important to us how we know that the code that we deliver to our customer, they can be verified that it has integrity. And it has to go from the time we commit it to GitHub to the time it gets into our repository, our distribution, to a Linux distribution, and then consumed by the end customer. And so we're required to create sort of a transparent way that this information flows through the system, almost like an identity is a different type of artifact, but you could also say it's a piece of software. And this sort of gets in the direction I wanted to go, which is we can't go from nowhere to solving US privacy. That's going to be hard. Are there any middle steps? Are there any things we can look at now where we can say, hey, look, here's a trust framework in this area, or here's another. They used to say states are the laboratories for the federal government, state government, but maybe other international or other national governments abroad are the laboratory for the US government where things have to scale. Where are the other trust frameworks that we can look at and grow from so we're not building from nothing?
There's quite a lot that's happened in this regard, actually. So you have, and I don't want to do this in an order that implies any favoritism or anything, right? So, but just let's go up into Canada, DIAC. You have Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, where they've worked on specific concepts. What are some of the rules of how you would identify those concepts? What makes a verified person? And they've tacked together things that that come together into that pan-Canadian trust framework. In Australia, you have TDIF, which I'm going to forget the acronym, but essentially set some of the same, different terminology and some of the same, but the same concepts as what you'll find in NIST 800-63. This is how we're going to do the proofing. This is how we're going to do our credential protection. This is how we want to do user authentication. So at least the technical rules of the road. And then that sets things so that you can then back that with legislative action when necessary. So now and it makes it much easier to fund these things too. So in Australia is a good example where the background rules of the road were set from a digital transformation agency, from a government agency. And it's starting to enable a little more of an ecosystem. In the UK, you have GPG 45. You have EIDAS in the EU, which has now evolved even to the point where there's some, architectures for wallets attached to that, for wallet applications. So even within the US, you have FICAM which was limited in scope to federal agencies, but could be applied conceptually to others. But those are some examples. And so I don't think that there's a need you're definitely not starting from scratch. What you want to do is start from all the concepts that exist. On the concepts that exist, I know OpenID Foundation has, it may have been Open Identity Exchange, has done a white paper comparing and contrasting the different trust frameworks that I think was just recently published. And so these are starting places, and then you want to then make that, okay, within the regions that apply here, within the United States, how specifically do we want to do this? What specifically do we want to refer to? What's the group of standards? What's the group of regulations? How do you let the states continue to make those work within their individual regions and fit within the larger whole? So those are all the considerations.
Ross, do you see any examples in the federal space of federations that have worked and have delivered value?
So there are some. There is within the community of where they're trying to convey information between parties, like sheriffs telling information to other people. Right, there's some federations that operate there, and they have a trust framework involved in that. The federal government uses different educational organizations. So Georgia Tech Research Institute helped develop a trust framework there. Conterra Initiative also has a trust framework that's very similar to that one, because the teams were all working kind of together on that. But it's fairly nascent, right? And even where there's some suggestion that there should be these trust frameworks between, let's just say, federation parties, doing SAML. What I see often, Mike, is there's not been like a governance capability where they're, putting in place, making sure that both parties are doing X, Y, and Z in accordance with some governance characteristics. What I see is they're putting the cryptographic material in place so that the federation can occur, but there's not much thoughtful governance on top of that, right? I think that's a part that's missing, is, to formalize how we're going to instantiate these trust frameworks, to what the parties are going to do, how they're going to interact, really the rules of the road between the federation of parties, right? It's just something that there's work to be done, I would say.
One of the challenges of forming these trust frameworks is that it's a project that never ends. I once had a conversation in the aerospace industry where the conclusion was, we don't know how to fund it because we fund projects and this thing lives forever. So making a trust framework is difficult. The one that I think of is OBI, the Open Banking Implementation Entity in the UK, which allows banks and relying parties like fintech applications to share data. That's a very modern one. But one of the things I wanted to point out, and let me try and share my screen here.
Well, you're sharing. I'm going to say, so this is why I said it needs to be sustainable. It needs a business model that lets it operate on its, on its own for a while. And so whatever that model is, otherwise it's unfunded and it won't happen.
Yeah. So how to fund and operate. But I want to bring up one interesting point about these trust models is that the trust models we currently have are generally based upon two entities, the IDP and the relying party, the identity provider and the relying party. But in this ecosystem for mobile driver's license and decentralized, we have really three entities. We have the holder, the verifier, and the issuer. And each of these needs to be trusted. So, in a way, when I wonder aloud if we have any models, I don't see any models that actually have these three participants. Are there any real in production trust frameworks that actually account for these three actors instead of our old style, federated identity two-party systems?
It's interesting because I think I thought the ones that I called out did in fact do that because they're going to have privacy protection, essentially consumer protection built in
But
them.
are those in development or are those in production? Like, is there actually data flowing back and forth and people are doing real things like businesses are using them? Because I thought that the work that was going on in Canada was still almost like in the R&D and exploratory phase, not actually in production.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at Canada as an example, so you do have operating what was Secure Keys, Concierge, and Verified Me that is operating, and you have, which is very similar to, has conceptual similarities to, say, the Scandinavian countries' bank ID setups. What you've done is reduced the set of participants. It's not necessarily a universal set of participants. You reduced it. You kind of like, okay, within the bank infrastructure, and then who adds themselves to the bank infrastructure. And that's by reducing the set of participants, you can make it smaller in scope and easier to implement and stick with the rules. It's like saying you reduce all the bilateral agreements that might be between these entities down to one. That's the benefit of a trust framework. Reduce the set of people that can participate. That makes it easier to participate. The Verified Me, which is, a great concept and really well sold in Canada and has utility. I think that's in production and functioning. Though you hear the tentativeness in my voice because I'm unsure. Right. I'd rather have if we have a member of the audience who can speak more clearly to that, that'd be great.
Mike, there are information exchanges, right, that where they have agreed upon taxonomy, how they're going to do it, and they have cryptographic endpoints that do function, right? I mean, I remember worked in healthcare. HL7 is one of those things. There's a NIF framework that describes how National Information Exchange framework that talks about, you can build, there's different communities that use that framework, right? And they exist, right? I don't think I know many of them that exist in this realm, right? Where this may, the identity realm may be part of it, but it's not the main focus of that framework, right? It's the data they're trying to exchange is the main focus of that framework.
And David, you pointed out some interesting observations about who gets the value in these ecosystems. And one of the challenges is, we talked about the federation operator, the project that never ends, and what value do they get out of it? What value do the issuers get out of it? It seems like the only place people can agree, the only party we can all agree on that gets value out of it is the relying parties. Actually, in the slide I previously showed, the end user gets some convenience out of it. But can you talk about some of the challenges and what's the killer application that would drive people to demand that the Congress help govern these new federations? Like, where's the value coming from?
I don't know if I have an answer for the second part of that question, is what is the killer use case? Because, I mean, honestly, everybody's been talking about what that is. I find it interesting that, we've sort of looked at the value stream and say that relying parties will get the most value out of it. And yet they're the ones that we're all struggling to bring in to have them take part. But looking at, let's restrict the scope down into mobile driver's license, and that is that consumers see the value that they could get from this, and future tense here, that they could get from this, and that's what they want. Like, oh yeah, I want to take that thing off the back of my phone and put it in my phone, and that's going to be easier for me. So they see that value to themselves. The issuers that have done this so far are not extracting value from this, and when you look at, they're performing a public service of issuing these and making this available to people to use. And there's not a flow that covers what they're doing, aside from if it's been legislatively funded, or a champion within the organization that's kind of pushing this. The few models that have been turned over to be consumer pays subscription models, Utah, Florida. Florida's model is different. Florida's model is not consumer pays, but the consumer, like that was met with a lot of pushback. You're going to make me pay $1.99 a year for this. Yet no state funds were used to actually produce it. It was done, it was put together aside from the people's time. And so, the value stream mapping essentially is still out there to be done, and to find the killer use case. It might be that when the online, over the internet interactions are settled with this, when that becomes available, that may kickstart this better, because you have a tremendous amount of fraud that's happened with state benefits, federal benefits. There's been the fraud from the lack of accurate identity that's happened in those spaces, and removing that fraud can be something that's a financial engine to drive the rest of it. So I do think that once the over the internet pieces are there, and government entities start to realize that they can be more accurate in what they're doing, then I think that's going to start to drive, that could kickstart it. But it's a tough problem, what the value stream mapping is and how we connect all these things up.
Well, let me ask a quick question about mobile driver's license specifically. In what wallets do you think we will be able to hold these mobile driver's license?
So that there's a current state of things and there's a future state of things. The current state of things, there's essentially a one-to-one pairing or a one-to-few pairing of the issuers and the credentials for the most part. And but as we go forward in the future, there's multiple standards happening within the OpenID space, W3C space, ISO space, that should allow for people to choose the wallet application that they want to use. And if you want to choose a platform wallet, the Apple Wallet, Google Wallet, Samsung Wallet, the ones that works. If there's cloud wallets as well, if you want to choose one of those, if you want to go purchase an application because it's a great wallet and it has the features that you want, you could do that. In the EU, there's mandates for each of the member states to create a wallet application available for citizens to use. That model fits pretty well there, and I would assume that people will use those. But there's that ideal state that I think we can get to within a few years. That ideal state to me is the one that's best for privacy. I want to choose the wallet. I want to choose the wallet application, and most people would want to choose what they're going to do, and they'll choose based on their own sets of needs, functionally, their sets of concerns. Do I want all of my transactions for all of my everything that I do, payments and identity, in my Apple Wallet? There's some conveniences come out of that. There's concerns that come out of that, right? Do I want all of that? Do I want those transactions I'm from Massachusetts, in a Massachusetts state wallet? There's concerns that people will have about that. And depending on who you are, you'll make a different choice. That choice is what we need to be supporting. So I think as we start to build out like ISO 23220 and these interactions are capable, you can get different credentials from different sources to place in your wallet. That's going to be a much better solution for people.
To push back a little bit, though, I as a citizen might want to put my mobile driver's license in my MetaMask wallet, which is probably not possible, but my state might not trust MetaMask to hold my wallet and keep it safe. Is this going back to why we need trust frameworks? Because as a consumer, I can only choose from the wallets that have actually been trusted by the issuers. This is a new challenge, I think.
And yes, I agree. That is a new challenge. And yes, you're right. This goes back to why we need those rules of the road. What is credential protection? What's the level of credential protection for things that are in a wallet application that is considered a minimum? And how you don't want to force the scenario where the dozens of wallet applications that might meet some set of standards have to go and create agreements with all of those other state issuers. You want to pool these things together, get out from like the bilateral agreements that you would have to make in those scenarios. You pass a set of criteria, you demonstrate that this wallet application meets that set of criteria, and then it becomes active across a whole platform without having to. So again, another reason why we need it's not just the consumer protection, it's all of the rules of the road enable participants to come in and join into those rules of the road, and then everybody is protected.
Yep.
Russ, I'm going to put you on the spot. What's your level of optimism that we see a trust framework for online privacy like David is describing?
I think in the fullness of time we will, but I think Kalia did a good job last week of talking about how things are differentiated by cultures and countries, right? And I think you're going to see that continue to be the way things evolve, right? Some countries are going to be putting frameworks together that actually address this across their entire country. And the United States, I don't think that's realistic in the near future, but I do think that, as states continue to issue mobile driver's licenses, there'll be, kind of a drive towards interoperability between those things. And that's going to spawn some kind of governance capabilities, right? That it might specify how the wallets function, might specify, just different functions that can be adopted. I do think the ISO standard is a technical function that to build upon, right? It has certain capabilities right now, and I think they're anticipating doing more, right, over time, and we'll just see how that evolves, and then how that'll support greater interaction between different, states, and because states are the ones that have in America, that states are the ones that have that, that root of understanding of who the individual is.
States produce lots of other credentials for people to hold, and not just driver's licenses and ID cards. And so I would say it's gonna be multi-format. There's going to be a lot of that happening. I think we have two pathways to get there. We can take the pathway of not doing anything, and then when the problems occur, they all have to be addressed, and we'll end up with a trust framework at great cost. Or we can start ahead of time and do some planning, and probably at lower cost end up with a trust framework.
So I want to thank our guest, David Keltz. Thank you so much. And our co-host, our Identerati co-host this week, Ross Ford. Thank you guys for a great conversation. And we can follow up on the LinkedIn chat and add things to the wiki page. So thank you so much, guys.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Mike.
And next week, we're going to discuss with, it'll be a conversation between Tyke, Glue, and Curity about token exchange. So please join us on Thursday, 12 o'clock CST. Thanks, everyone.